a few things. So this is, I hope some of you have got to see the poster series, which is in the second floor of the library. So climate change in India, what do we know and how? So this was sort of premiered on 18th Feb at Science at the Sabha in the Anna Centenary Library. So this is something that we've started now doing along with our Science at the Sabha, which is an annual IMSC event. So we have a poster series that goes along with it, and then it kind of travels in Chennai for a year. After that, we make it available online. So this year, the poster series was actually some lunch table conversation at IMSC where someone was like, hey, but there's all this science about climate change, like we should try to communicate that. So that's kind of what this came out of. I worked, Shankar and I, suddenly volume's gone up. Yeah. So Shankar, who many of you might know, he's a IMSc professor, now retired, a physicist who also works now in the field of climate change, specifically on glaciers. So he and I kind of curated it, and we picked out 12 different topics and asked contributors and reached out to different contributors all over the country, some even outside the country, and to contribute, and then we kind of edited it and put it together. So maybe I'll just ask Shanks to tell us a few things of the topics and how we got here.
Good afternoon to all. Actually, when I started giving popular talks on this climate change, etc., around 2010, 15 years ago, there was a skepticism from all sections, undergraduate students to senior profs in earth sciences even. So people weren't convinced that it was a real thing. It was always seen as mixed up with politics, various conspiracy theories, etc., etc. But now I think that stage is over. Typically, people do seem convinced that climate change is real, and it is because of human activity. There are still holdouts, but by and large, this has become the establishment point of view, in my perception. So then there is, after that, two issues, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means what can you do to limit it? Limit the global warming and consequently climate change to the minimum possible. And as Jayaraman's abstract says, that has to be a global effort, and we'll hear more about that in the talk. Adaptation is, given that some amount of global warming and therefore climate change is inevitable, how do we adapt to it, adjust to it? Now that's a local issue because the effects are different in different places. Even the warming is more in the north, less in the equator. It changes place to place, the actual effect. So those are more local issues. This poster series mainly concentrates on them, not solely, but mainly on scientific studies in India or on different types of effects. It is not a comprehensive, coverage of all the impacts and this thing, but just to give some people some feel for what is known by scientific work about the effects in India, in a few examples over there. So I think that is, and then there were some other posters, including some on mitigation. Some of these posters also, papers and therefore posters, suggested adaptation strategies. So both these things are going to become more and more important as we go along. And that's mainly what the poster series is about.
So since this is the first time sort of we're having a talk, I wanted a few other people also to kind of to come in. So we had Mani, who works at IMSC. So he, along with Uttara, did the translations. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about how that worked.
So I'll just say a few words about the translation itself. And I think it is really important that these research findings are available in Tamil too, so that a larger set of people can be part of the climate change conversation. And so we are really glad that we have brought out these posters in Tamil. And I did the first drafts, but putting them together in easily understandable language would not have been possible without Uttara ma'am's support. So thanks to her. And also, I'd also like to thank Professors S. Krishnaswamy and R. Usha, who are not here today. They helped in vetting the translations. So thank you.
And finally, we worked with a very nice designer who helped us put it all together and make what the pretty posters that you see, um, that you saw from the text and like all these references and all these things, figures and plots that we had. So Radha is here. Maybe she can say a few things.
Hi. So I have a phone because I'm very scared of talking in public. So I feel like in general, like climate change broadly to me was like the shifting of patterns in weather and temperature. So I thought it would be fun for the title to do the same. So if you see the font of the title, there's a lot of like anomalies in the characters of the letters. So you'll find like an E that's a bit wonky. And so that was kind of the idea of that was just to throw you a little bit off whack and feel like it's not consistent. And then I also took some time to decide on a color palette that goes through the whole series. So like green for earth, light blue for wind, sort of royal blue for oceans, little red for like heat and temperature and stuff. And finally black to depict like contamination, pollution, decay, all that fun stuff. So, and then mainly like I feel like the imagery is kind of quite self-explanatory, like in terms of like the content, it was just reflections of the content that was in the poster. And it was quite content heavy, so it's fine, but it was really cool to interact and work in that space where there was so much research had gone into it and so much like specific, being particular about certain things being there. So I thought it was very nice to work with that kind of thing. And I made sure that the background was like a little bit eroded and decayed. So you kind of feel like there's something disappearing or changing, shifting. But yeah, I was like so happy that Varuni asked me to help with this. So I like latched on like a parasite. But yeah, that's about it.
Thanks. So now so two of the posters were contributed by Jayaraman, who's our speaker today. So he's a senior fellow of climate change at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, so MSSRF, which is just the road next door. He's been working in climate policy and been actively associated with equity and climate justice. In fact, one of the posters that he contributed for this series was about equity. And he also works on the role these play in science policy interface in climate change. He was involved in the negotiations at the UNFCCC and IPCC on behalf of the government of India. And he's going to talk about some of that, I think, today. So he was actually at IMSC many years ago. And then after that was at the Tata Institute for Social Sciences, TIS in Mumbai. So now he's back here and he works with MSSRF. So over to you.
Okay, thank you Varuni, Shankar and others for this opportunity to talk again about issue that everybody ought to be concerned with, even if they are not. In some form, I think people are increasingly aware of it, though it varies across countries, it varies across the levels of development, it varies across which section of society one belongs to, many things like that, but that is always typical of global issues. But I think there is a lot of interest justifiably in this, but unfortunately there's also a lot of, I wouldn't say misinformation, but information that is very incomplete, okay, for the most part. There is misinformation, of course, and active disinformation, but I think a lot of it is about missing gaps in information. So one of the things I feel is always even when it looks a little boring and seems like you're talking about details, it's important to get some of this thing right. So the other day, someone with some experience in dealing with climate issues sent me a WhatsApp message saying, confusing the role of IPCC and the UNFCC. And so it was unfortunate. It was amusing at first, but unfortunate because really it was a person one would have thought would know better. So things like that. So here it goes. So today I won't be talking about the IPCC, I won't be talking about the science as such, but I'll be talking about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Okay? So this is, of course, the United Nations body which is responsible for dealing with the problem of global warming. Now, there is a little bit of confusion. The UNFCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, refers in the first instance to the actual convention, an agreement which was signed now by more than 192 countries. It also refers to the implementation of the agreement as an ongoing process. So the UNFCC is like a multilateral institution. So there is the treaty, the institution, and there is also its secretariat, which often is, the word secretariat is dropped, so they say the UNFCC says, but it is not as if all the countries who are part of the UNFCC are saying it, but it is the executive secretary who represents it who is saying it. So there are these different ways in which this is used. If you remember this, I think you can just follow it by context. So I won't get back to this in any detail. So global warming is what we call, it's a term coming from economics, but it is pretty straightforward, of what you call a global collective action problem. So global warming, we all know some idea, we have some idea what it is, due to carbon dioxide emissions or release of stored carbon in any form, including trees, peat, soils, etc., anywhere on the planet. When it is released, the stored carbon, you call it, this leads to global warming, and the primary source way and above of global warming is, which refers to the rise in the Earth's surface temperature, is due to carbon dioxide. There are other greenhouse gases, notably methane, nitrous oxide. There are this hydrofluorocarbons and other such gases. There are also some categories of aerosols. Some aerosols warm, some aerosols actually cool. So the warming aerosols, so there can be other reasons, but it is important to remember that way and ahead, the most important of these is carbon dioxide, and reducing carbon dioxide cannot be substituted by saying I'll reduce this first, then I'll get back to carbon dioxide. And that's kind of not correct, but I won't go into that detail further. The real problem with carbon dioxide is that if you want to help the planet if you stop emitting carbon dioxide or whatever is the source of such emissions, your action alone is not sufficient, because if somebody else is emitting carbon dioxide by whatever kind of activity, then that contributes to warming the planet as much as if the fact that you are not doing it is not of much use. In fact, the world is very sharply divided among those who emit and a few who emit quite a lot, and a lot of people who emit quite a little. And so this adds to the problem. So it is what economists, as I said, call a collective action problem. It requires collective action by all, but there are costs involved. And these costs are also highly unequally distributed. There are some who have privilege but are unwilling to give it up. There are some who may have need or recourse to these emissions, who might have to undertake activity which leads to emissions. So, if you tell them you have to cut emissions, then it doesn't work. So this makes for a complex problem. And of course, this is not as if we were dealing with the other major gas that we dealt with, which we have dealt with rather successfully, which is the release of chlorofluorocarbons that damage the ozone layer. That's its scope in human activity is very limited. There are only a few very specific activities where ozone layer damaging gases are released, and with a simple agreement relatively called the Montreal Protocol, this has been fairly successfully dealt with, and the consensus is that the ozone hole is not, the damage to the ozone layer is being repaired, is being set right. So it can be done. But the problem with fossil fuels is, as one American observer put it, it is the very life raft which has floated humanity in dealing with disaster. That very life raft is the source of your problems. Because it is industrial civilization that has contributed a great deal to our ability to resist the vagaries of weather. Nature you think of as bountiful, except when you are under an avalanche or a landslide, or you have a tsunami coming your way. Then of course nature is rather awesomely fearful. Earthquakes and tsunamis are about the scariest things you can see. So, nature is not quite as benevolent as you think all the time. And in a pre-industrial era, humanity was exposed to the vagaries of weather, as still a part of the world's population is. So, obviously, there is this industrial civilization, which has, the era of industrialization, which has helped us face the vagaries of nature, enabled well-being on a mass scale through productive activities, etc. This is the very origin of what is currently our challenge. So, this is very different from what happens with pollution in the general sense, or even issues like the ozone layer. So just, I took some time over this, but I think it's important to get this right. So there's a small definition I put here of what a collective action problem is, but that's not very complicated. So by 1992, it was clear that the world had to do something about this problem. The United States, which was in the lead, in one of the countries which took the lead in its action, was also where there was a substantial amount of skepticism, but nevertheless, it was their cooperation which moved the world forward. They had an important role. But all other countries were also very deeply concerned. So, following a UN General Assembly resolution, over a period of 2 to 3 years, there were intense negotiations. The IPCC was formed, and eventually there is a treaty, an agreement on climate change which was required, which was negotiated over 2.5 years. It's very interesting to go back and dig that history. And there was clearly, by the Rio summit at 1992, a document contested, a lot of difficult negotiations, but nevertheless, successfully we had this framework convention on climate change. So it was a very forward-looking agenda, integrated other UN principles, and it had so what one must say, ethically very positive attitude. Sometimes in moments I think that if we had to negotiate such a treaty from scratch today, we would not succeed. It was an extraordinary conjuncture that it happened in 92, and in India and many other countries across the global south, including the big ones like China or others, including all the Middle East, including Latin America, across the world, I think there is great support for the fundamental principles of the UNFCCC. What are some of its key elements? And this is, I think, now that we are in the era of actually doing something about climate change, I think it's very important to look at these principles. They are not to be dismissed. I think they hold a place alongside the Declaration of Human Rights and social and economic rights. Dealing with this global challenge is, I think, these principles are foundationally important. So, equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, the convention states, I'll call it the convention, the UNFCCC in short, the climate convention states, is the basis of action to protect the climate system. Now, this has become, especially unfortunately in some environmental circles, something people sneer at. And I think this is absolutely misplaced. And this is the first point I want to drive home. Okay? There is no way that we can have a world where you take some kind of neo-Malthusian attitude of, the poor can look out for themselves. If they suffer, some people will suffer. You have to protect the climate. This is environment. And somehow you pose the question as one of environment versus people, environment versus society. In which case, of course, it becomes very problematic. The whole point about sustainable development, and is very clear even from the Brundtland Commission report and all of that, that the harmony of environment and development is the real challenge. Otherwise, sustainable development has no challenge whatsoever inside it. You choose one or the other and we fight over it. So these principles are very important, and it is not replaced by this popular phrase called national circumstances. See, the wording is very precise. Common but differentiated responsibility. It is not simply differentiated. It is common. But common does not mean everybody does everything identically. So this is what you would call a term of some quite significant, some significance in international law, and it will be very interesting since there is a reference from the UN on climate change to the International Court of Justice, what kind of judgment and decision we'll get on this. This is something to look out for. It also says that developed countries ought to take the lead in climate action. There is acknowledgement that some countries are disproportionately, the rich countries of the world, the developed countries are disproportionately responsible for both the past and current emissions, and there is reference to it in the preamble. It also says that developed countries should provide the means of implementation, as they are called in UN language, which refers to climate finance, technology transfer, and support for capacity building. Capacity meaning in a variety of ways, could be knowledge, organizational, technical skills, etc. And this climate finance in particular is not to substitute over, developmental assistance, which was already in place at the time the treaty was signed. It was to be new and additional. It was not to be simply from private sources, because private sources would look for return on investment, and many of the actions with regard to climate change may not be those which will fetch financial returns. If you want to protect coastal communities, it's not obvious that, a company can stand to make profits from it. Or if they did, then the communities perhaps end up being worse off than they were earlier. So I think it's public sources of climate finance was very important, and the fact that concessional loans and grants, and this is not a means by which new indebtedness is created for developing countries. Also, the importance of adaptation in balance with mitigation is not simply everybody reduces the emissions and whatever is the consequence, people have to lump it, so to speak, So adaptation is as much a responsibility as anything else. So the whole ball game about this, and I think if you go back and read it, and I really urge all of you to find the occasion to read this text. When you read it, you see that there is, it's really the way it is crafted is very valuable, and I think it's a valuable resource for humanity. And India, I must say, played a excellent role in, a leading role in the formulation of this principles of the UNFCCC. There are very interesting accounts by particularly the late Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, who was a senior foreign affairs official in our ministry, who took a lead role in these negotiations. Also, Mr. Nitin Desai, who served a long time in the United Nations organization at that time. So after this, the name of the game has been the implementation of the UNFCCC. So I think the point I want to emphasize before I move forward is that a treaty of this kind is essential. So the UNFCCC is not something dreamed up by a bunch of lawyers or a bunch of political figures, is not some conspiracy of Shell or Exxon or whoever it is. It is something that we need because it is a collective action problem, and there is no way that a world can solve the problem without dealing with this. And all this sort of vague talk you hear that, recently I was very surprised. They should have known better. Some IPCC scientists gave an interview to The Guardian where they said that, the scientists, a group of scientists should have a veto power over the policies of governments. Governments should declare the policies, and the scientists should vet them and say yes or no, whether it's okay or not. I think I haven't heard of a more absurd suggestion, frankly. No stakeholder, or as they call it, or no individual section can have that claim. And it is up to the collective wisdom of humanity, and it cannot be. So I think I found this an extraordinarily, weird suggestion, because it's simply impossible that something that involves the entire world, that it goes to the foundation of our modern industrial activity, the way we conceive of the world, etc., that you take recourse to some such this thing. And also this idea somehow that you need some benign, benevolent authoritarian rule that will then dictate to the rest of the world is another absurd option. There are talk, for instance, Brazil, for instance, has a genuine problem with dealing with the Amazon. to control deforestation in the Amazon, which adds to uh, emissions and global warming. And of course, you had a president of Brazil who said he doesn't care about global warming. They have just elected a similar personality as president of Argentina. So the various countries have political leaders who have their own opinions in the matter. But there were extraordinary suggestions, including from political circles, that countries should take diplomatic or some economic action like sanctions against countries like Brazil. That kind of thing will not work. So I think the convention as the forum, the other great temptation that you see today, and this is also problematic, is, for instance, to say there are other forums, maybe we can. This is the UNFCCC, nothing is getting done, we must do something urgently. So let the G7 decide, which is the guys who are responsible for the problem in the first place, as I'll just mention in a bit. Or the other thing is the G20 should take the lead. It's one thing to say that those who have the capacity should put their heads together and see if they can do more. Nobody could quarrel with that. But somehow this idea that a small climate club, as they call it, which constitutes 75% of emissions, if they go ahead and take action, we'll solve the problem. I think this kind of undemocratic solutions are destined to fail. And we have seen repeatedly in political and economic matters that when you thrust such solutions down people's throats or the throats of other countries, they don't work. So let me move on. So it has been a long story of getting this actual implementation. And unfortunately, the story has been that, as always, once it became clear after the initial enthusiasm of signing the treaty that you would have all countries doing equally rather than equitably their share of climate action, it became a question of how developed countries would then get developing countries on board. Now, this story doesn't begin with the UNFCCC, and this is what I want to emphasize. It has a long history, and the first example of this was the story of what is called limits to growth. There's a famous study that appeared early in 1970, and it says quite openly, I mean there's no ifs and buts about it. It says very clearly that the developed countries have gotten rich, and it was sponsored by the OECD, which is the Rich Guys Club, though there are a couple of poor cousins on its rolls, but that's a separate story. But so there are this club, so they have all developed using, their wealth depends on the use of natural resources. But what will happen if China and India get into the act? And that whole study begins with that premise. When the rest of the world seek the same kind of standards of living, can the world take it? Now, of course, there is a tendency for, if you wish, in our culture, in many other cultures, of being abstemious, being frugal, being ascetic even, not, being full of worldly goods. It's there in all cultures and ways of thinking in one way or the other. But this cannot become economic policy. So it's one thing to quote Gandhiji as that, the world has enough to satisfy everyone's needs, but not everyone's greed. Now, that's fine as a moral goal, but that cannot dictate exactly how economic policy works. So, this long story, therefore, continued with the UNFCCC despite its excellent foundational principles of diluting differentiation, the difference between rich and poor, between developed and developing, and the provision of means of implementation, which simply did not happen. So one of the landmarks in this was Copenhagen, and till Copenhagen in 2009, from 1992, 17 years, it had always been thought that the developed countries would take upon themselves some binding quotas of what they should do, some target for which they were responsible. That was finally given up in Copenhagen. So they said everybody will promise what is possible, what they think they can do, and what they are liable for is its implementation of their promise. But what they promise is not framed by anyone else except voluntarily. Now, of course, that's something which remains and haunts us to this day. So then the other thing was, of course, after 17 years, finally they put up this figure of what kind of financial assistance would be possible. The famous figure of providing 100 billion US dollars annually by 2020 for climate change. So of course, we are in 2024. Nothing of the sort has happened. There is even an argument over whether it is 100 billion. So of course it's not 100 billion. The OECD claims it's now close to 89. Every year Oxfam has a report, and the latest Oxfam report said something like in the low 30s, 32, 33, whatever. So obviously this money is not coming. So then, after Copenhagen, after the voluntary thing, there was a fresh push by a group of countries, including the European Union, the African countries, etc., at Durban in 2011. And there the goal was to sign an agreement which would be legally binding on all. And the original idea was this legally binding agreement would be targets for all. And of course, countries like India were very nervous about it, etc. But what turned out, of course, was something quite different. So the voluntary pledges regime that began in Copenhagen was solidified. Legally binding commitments on none. So you just promise what you will do. They introduced the phrase national circumstances, which was a real dilution of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So the developed countries said we have no responsibility for what we have used of emissions in the past, what we have contributed to warming. Though of course, developing countries don't allow them to forget it. All the global south countries. So there was various ways in which the responsibility of the rich of the world to provide for the whole world as a collective to deal with this problem, this whole perspective continued to be diluted. So post 2020, let me not dwell further on the details. Of course, one of the problems was that despite the fact that we had already reached 20 years past the climate convention being signed, the United States remains, for instance, in a situation where it goes in and out of climate agreements. The United States was party to the final form of what was called the Kyoto Protocol, signed in 1997. And then the United States, everybody went home, Al Gore went home, and then the US Senate told him, we are not going to ratify this. And across the board, not just one side, Democrats and Republicans